It is 1:30 in the morning, July 17th, 1918. Somewhere in a quiet house in Yekaterinburg, Russia, 4 young women are shaken awake and told to get dressed. Their father carries their brother, who is too sick to walk. Their mother asks for a chair because her legs ache. They are told they are being moved, that it's for their safety, that a car is coming. They believe it. They walk down 23 steps into a basement room. It is small, barely 12 feet across. There are no windows. The walls are bare. Their father stands at the front. Their mother sits beside him. The 4 sisters stand together near the back wall. Olga is 22. Tatiana is 21. Maria is 19. Anastasia has just turned 17. They are carrying small pillows. Sewn inside those pillows, and inside the bodices of their dresses, are diamonds, rubies, and ropes of pearls, not for vanity, for survival. Their mother told them the jewels might buy safe passage if the family ever escaped. They will not escape. In a few minutes this room will fill with smoke and screaming. But right now, it is almost silent. Right now, 4 sisters are standing together in a basement, still believing that someone is coming to take them somewhere safe. To understand what is about to happen, you have to understand who they were. Before they were prisoners, before they were symbols, before they were saints, they were simply daughters. And their story begins not with politics or revolution, but with a love story that should never have worked. Nicholas Romanov was the heir to the most powerful throne in Europe. Alexandra was a German princess, beautiful, serious, deeply religious, and far from the most strategic match. The Russian court wanted someone else. His parents wanted someone else. But Nicholas wanted her. He wrote in his diary the night they became engaged, "A marvelous, unforgettable day in my life, the day of my betrothal to my darling, adorable Alex." They married in November 1894. Just weeks after his father's sudden death. Nicholas was 26, Alexandra was 22, and he was now Tsar of all Russia, a role he never wanted and never felt ready for. But in their private world, they were happy, desperately, almost obsessively happy. They called each other pet names. They wrote love letters even when they were in the same palace, and they wanted children. Olga arrived in 1895, Tatiana in 1897, Maria in 1899, Anastasia in 1901, 4 daughters, 4 healthy, beautiful daughters, and 4 disappointments. Not to Nicholas, he adored them, but to the empire, each girl was a failure. Russia needed a male heir. The Romanov dynasty required a son to continue the bloodline. With each daughter, the pressure mounted. With each daughter, Alexandra felt the weight of a nation's judgment. She became consumed by the need to produce a boy. She prayed constantly. She consulted healers and mystics. She withdrew from court life, suspicious of the aristocrats who whispered about her behind their gloves. And then, in 1904, she finally gave birth to a son. His name was Alexei. He was perfect. He was the answer to everything. And within weeks, they discovered he had hemophilia, the bleeding disease. A small bruise could kill him. A minor fall could cause internal bleeding that would leave him screaming in agony for days. Alexandra had given Russia its heir, and she had also sealed her family's fate. But that darkness was still years away. For now, there were 4 little girls growing up in a palace, unaware of the shadows gathering at the edges of their world. They called themselves OTMA. It was a nickname made from their initials, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and they used it to sign letters, give gifts, and make decisions together. They were not 4 separate girls. They were a unit, a small, private world unto themselves, and each of them was utterly distinct. Olga, the eldest, was the thinker. She had her father's soft eyes and her mother's melancholy. She read constantly, wrote poetry, played piano with real skill, and often withdrew into herself when the world became too loud. She was the most likely to challenge her parents, the most likely to question why things had to be a certain way. At 13, she told a friend that she found formal court events exhausting and false. She was not built for performance, she was built for depth. Tatiana was the opposite. Tall, elegant, and composed, she was the organizer, the one who kept schedules, managed the younger sisters, and quietly took charge whenever their mother was unwell. The servants called her the governess because she noticed everything and tolerated nothing sloppy, but she was also fiercely protective, especially of Olga, and the two shared a bedroom, a bond, and a lifetime of whispered conversations in the dark. Maria was the heart. She was the most beautiful of the four, wide blue eyes, a natural warmth that made everyone feel seen. She dreamed of marriage, of having many children, of a simple life with a soldier who loved her. She flirted easily, blushed often, and was endlessly teased by her sisters for being romantic. But beneath the sweetness was a steadiness. Maria was the peacemaker, the one who smoothed conflicts and never held grudges. And then there was Anastasia, the youngest, the wild one, the one who did impressions of tutors behind their backs, tripped servants for laughs, hid under tables during lessons, and could never sit still. She was short, slightly stocky, and absolutely unconcerned with elegance. While Tatiana practiced posture, Anastasia climbed trees. While Maria dreamed of princes, Anastasia played pranks. But she was also tender. She wrote letters to her father filled with jokes and drawings. She stayed close to Alexei, her fragile younger brother, making him laugh when he was bedridden with pain. Together, the four sisters shared 2 simple bedrooms, not lavish suites, but military cots with hard mattresses. Alexandra insisted on cold baths every morning, mended clothing, and limited luxuries. She wanted her daughters to be strong, not spoiled. They played in the gardens. They sailed on the Imperial yacht. They took photographs with a camera Anastasia loved to use, often blurry, often silly, always full of life. They were grand duchesses of Russia. But in their private world, they were just sisters. They argued, forgave, laughed, and clung to each other. They did not know what was coming, but whatever came, they would face it together. Alexei changed everything. He was born in August 1904, finally, the son Russia had demanded. Church bells rang across the empire. Cannons fired in celebration. Alexandra wept with relief. After 4 daughters, she had delivered an heir. But within weeks, something was wrong. The baby bruised too easily. Small bumps left dark swelling beneath his skin. When he was circumcised, the bleeding wouldn't stop. The doctors confirmed what Alexandra already feared in her bones: hemophilia, the bleeding disease, inherited through her bloodline. It meant that any injury, a fall, a knock, a simple childhood tumble, could cause internal bleeding that might kill him. There was no cure. There was only constant vigilance, constant terror, and the knowledge that her son could die at any moment. Alexandra never recovered from the guilt. She withdrew from public life almost entirely. She stopped attending court functions. She grew suspicious of doctors, of advisors, of anyone who couldn't ease her son's suffering. And in her desperation, she turned to someone who could. His name was Grigory Rasputin. He was a Siberian peasant with wild hair, a matted beard, and pale eyes that people described as hypnotic. He claimed to be a holy man, a healer, a vessel of God's power. And somehow, through prayer, through calm, through some method no one has ever fully explained, he could soothe Alexei when the boy was screaming in pain. He could stop the bleeding when doctors had given up. Alexandra believed Rasputin was sent by God. She trusted him absolutely. The rest of Russia saw something else. They saw a filthy, uneducated peasant whispering in the Tsarina's ear. Rumors spread that he was her lover, that he controlled the government, that the Romanovs had fallen under the spell of a madman. The four sisters knew Rasputin. He visited the palace. He called them by affectionate nicknames. Olga, the eldest, grew uncomfortable around him as she got older. She sensed something wrong, something her mother refused to see, but she said nothing. Loyalty to Alexandra came first. Meanwhile, the girls were growing up. Olga turned 18, Tatiana began receiving suitors, Maria dreamed openly about marriage. Anastasia remained wild, but even she was beginning to understand that their world was not as stable as it appeared. Outside the palace walls, Russia was starving. Workers protested. Revolutionaries organized. The monarchy that had ruled for 300 years was beginning to crack. But inside the palace, Alexandra prayed, Alexei suffered, and Rasputin whispered. The family couldn't see the edge of the cliff. They were already standing on it. In the summer of 1914, the world collapsed. A gunshot in Sarajevo, a web of alliances pulled tight, and suddenly, Russia was at war. Olga was 18, Tatiana was 17, Maria was 15, Anastasia was 13. Within months, the wounded began arriving. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, young men missing limbs, faces burned beyond recognition, bodies shattered by artillery and machine guns. The hospitals overflowed, and the Romanov women decided they would help. Alexandra converted the palace halls into wards. She trained as a surgical nurse, not ceremonially, but genuinely, and she took Olga and Tatiana with her. The two eldest daughters earned their Red Cross certifications. They wore simple grey uniforms and white head coverings. They assisted in surgeries. They held down soldiers while doctors amputated limbs without enough anesthesia. They changed bandages soaked with blood and pus. They wrote letters home for men who could no longer hold a pen. Olga, the quiet one, often sat with the dying. She had a gift for stillness, for presence. Soldiers asked for her by name. She was 19 years old, and she had already seen more death than most people witness in a lifetime. Tatiana, ever the organizer, ran supply operations. She managed schedules, tracked inventory, and somehow maintained her composure, even when the wards smelled of gangrene and the screaming never stopped. Maria and Anastasia were too young for surgical work, but they visited the wounded regularly, reading aloud, playing games, bringing what small comfort they could. Maria, with her natural warmth, made soldiers fall in love with her weekly. Anastasia made them laugh, which was sometimes more valuable than medicine. The sisters grew up fast during those years. Their diaries from this period reveal a shift, less gossip about palace life, more reflections on suffering, on God, on what it meant to be useful. Olga wrote about feeling guilty for having food when soldiers starved. Tatiana wrote about a young officer who died holding her hand. They were still grand duchesses, but the war had stripped something away. Some innocence, some distance from the real world. They had seen what Russia was sacrificing. Soon, Russia would demand a sacrifice from them. By early 1917, Russia was breaking apart. The war had bled the country dry. Millions of soldiers were dead. Food shortages gripped the cities. Bread lines stretched for blocks in freezing temperatures. And the anger, at the government, at the aristocracy, at the Tsar himself, had reached a boiling point. In February, riots erupted in St. Petersburg. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. The Duma demanded change. And Nicholas, hundreds of miles away at military headquarters, found himself completely alone. On March 15, 1917, he signed his abdication. 300 years of Romanov rule ended with a signature on a train car. Nicholas returned to his family a private citizen. He was 48 years old. He had been Tsar since he was 26, and now he was nothing. When he arrived at Alexander Palace, the four sisters were sick. All of them had measles. Their heads had been shaved because of high fevers. They were weak, disoriented, and confined to their beds. And their father was no longer emperor. The transition was swift and disorienting. Soldiers now guarded the palace, not to protect the family, but to contain them. Servants began to leave. The gates were locked. The Romanovs could walk in the gardens, but only at designated times. They could receive no visitors without permission. They were prisoners in their own home. The sisters tried to maintain normalcy. They studied their lessons. They played card games. They put on small theatrical performances for each other. Anastasia made jokes. Maria flirted with the younger guards, who sometimes flirted back. Tatiana organized their reduced household with the same precision she had once applied to hospital wards. But the walls were closing in. In August 1917, the provisional government decided the family was too dangerous to keep near the capital. They were transferred to Tobolsk, a remote town in Siberia, frozen and isolated. The journey took days. The house they were given was modest, cold, and cramped. The sisters shared rooms. They hauled their own water. They watched their parents age visibly under the stress. Winter came. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero. News from the outside world arrived in fragments. Revolution, civil war, chaos. Olga turned 22 in Tobolsk. Tatiana turned 20. Maria turned 18. Anastasia turned 16. They celebrated with small cakes and forced smiles. They had no idea that their situation was about to get much worse. That spring, new orders arrived. The family was being moved again. The new prison had a name that meant nothing to them at first. Ipatiev House, a merchant's mansion in Yekaterinburg, commandeered by the Bolsheviks and given a chilling official title, the House of Special Purpose. They arrived in April 1918. Nicholas and Alexandra came first, with Maria. The others followed weeks later, once Alexei was strong enough to travel. When the four sisters were finally reunited, they found their world had shrunk to a handful of rooms. The windows had been whitewashed so they couldn't see out. The guards were coarse, hostile, and deliberately humiliating. They drew crude images on the bathroom walls. They watched the sisters constantly, even following them to the lavatory. They sang revolutionary songs outside their doors at night. The family was allowed 30 minutes of outdoor time per day. They walked in a small garden, circling the same patch of dirt, guards standing at every corner. Olga withdrew further into herself. She stopped writing in her diary as often. When she did write, the entries were short, tired, heavy. Tatiana took over managing what little household remained. She organized their clothes, their meals, their schedules, clinging to structure because structure was the only thing she could control. Maria, ever hopeful, tried to befriend the guards. Some responded. Most didn't. She was 20 years old, still dreaming of marriage, still believing that kindness could unlock any door. Anastasia made jokes. She played with the family's spaniel, Joy. She tried to keep Alexei entertained, but even she had grown quieter. The family pulled tighter together. Nicholas read aloud to them in the evenings. Chekhov, Tolstoy, the Bible. Alexandra, increasingly frail, spent hours in prayer. Alexei, now 13, could barely walk. His leg had been injured months earlier, and the internal bleeding had never fully healed. They received almost no news from the outside world. They didn't know that civil war was raging across Russia. They didn't know that white army forces, loyal to the Tsar, were advancing toward Yekaterinburg. They didn't know that their captors had already received instructions about what to do if rescue seemed imminent. The sisters sewed diamonds and pearls into their corsets. Alexandra told them the jewels might buy safe passage if they ever escaped. They still believed escape was possible. They still believed someone might come for them. Outside the whitewashed windows, the summer sun never fully set. Inside, the family waited. July arrived. On the evening of July 16, 1918, the family went to bed at their usual time. Nothing about the night felt different. Nicholas read aloud. Alexandra prayed. The sisters changed into their nightgowns, the ones with the jewels sewn inside. They had worn them so long the gems had become part of the fabric, hard and lumpy against their skin. They fell asleep. At 1:30 in the morning, Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the house, knocked on their door and told them to wake up and dress quickly. He told them the White Army was approaching and the family needed to be moved to a safer location. A truck was coming. They needed to wait in the basement. They believed him. Nicholas dressed in a military shirt and boots. Alexandra put on a dark skirt and blouse. The sisters helped each other fasten their corsets, the ones lined with diamonds. They brought small pillows. Anastasia carried Joy, the family spaniel. Nicholas carried Alexei down the stairs. The boy was too weak to walk. 23 steps. They counted them every day. They entered the basement room. It was small, half underground, with one dim electric light and a single locked door. Alexandra, in pain, asked for a chair. A second chair was brought for Alexei. Nicholas stood beside his son. Alexandra sat to his left. The 4 sisters stood behind their mother, clustered together. 3 servants and the family doctor stood near the wall. 11 people in a room barely large enough for 5. Yurovsky entered with 11 armed men. They filled the doorway. He pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket and began to read. The statement was short. Something about the Ural Soviet ordering the execution of the Romanov family. Nicholas turned to his family. He turned back to Yurovsky. He said one word. "What?" Yurovsky raised his revolver and shot Nicholas in the chest. He died almost instantly. The room exploded. 11 men firing at once in a space the size of a small bedroom. The noise was deafening. Smoke filled the air within seconds. Alexandra had time to raise her hand and cross herself before a bullet struck her skull. The servants and the doctor fell quickly, but the daughters did not. The bullets struck their bodies and ricocheted off the diamonds sewn into their clothing. The jewels, meant to buy their freedom, had turned their corsets into armor. The girls were thrown backward by the impact, but did not die. They screamed. The soldiers moved in with bayonets. In the smoke and chaos, they stabbed blindly. The bayonets bent and slid off the jewel-lined fabric. More gunshots, point blank. Anastasia, crouched against the wall, covered her head with her arms and screamed until a soldier struck her with a rifle butt. It took over 20 minutes. Olga was 22. Tatiana was 21. Maria was 19. Anastasia was 17. When the smoke cleared, the basement floor was slick with blood. The walls were pocked with bullet holes. The 4 sisters who had signed their letters as one, OTMA, died within feet of each other, in a room with no windows, in a house with a name that finally made sense, the House of Special Purpose. Before dawn, the bodies were loaded onto a truck. The soldiers wrapped them in sheets and drove into the forest outside Yekaterinburg. They had been ordered to make the Romanovs disappear, completely, permanently, as though they had never existed. The first plan was to drop the bodies down an abandoned mine shaft. They did, but the shaft was too shallow. The bodies were visible, so they pulled them out and tried again. They poured sulfuric acid on the faces to make identification impossible. They doused the remains in gasoline and attempted to burn them. The fire didn't finish the job. Finally, they buried most of the family in a shallow pit beneath a dirt road, packing railroad ties on top so that trucks driving over the spot would press the earth flat. 2 of the bodies, believed to be Alexei and one of the sisters, were buried separately, some distance away. Then they smoothed the ground, and they walked away. The Soviet government announced that Nicholas had been executed, but they said nothing about the rest of the family. For years, the official story shifted. The children had been moved, the children were safe, the children were in hiding. It was a lie. and the world half believed it. That half-belief created something strange. In the years that followed, dozens of women came forward claiming to be Anastasia. The most famous, Anna Anderson, maintained her claim for over 60 years. She was eventually disproven by DNA testing. But her story captivated the world, not because it was plausible, but because people needed it to be true. The idea that at least one sister had survived, had somehow crawled from that basement, escaped into the night, lived a secret life, was easier to accept than the alternative. The alternative was that 4 young women had stood together in a locked room and been butchered, that no one had come to save them, that the diamonds meant to buy their freedom had only prolonged their suffering. The world wasn't ready to sit with that, so it invented a different ending. But the dirt road in the forest kept its secret. And beneath it, the truth waited. The truth waited 73 years. In 1979, a Russian geologist named Alexander Avdenin and a filmmaker named Geli Ryabov quietly located the burial site using old Bolshevik documents and local accounts. They dug. They found skulls. They confirmed what they suspected. Then they reburied the remains and told no one. It was still the Soviet Union. Revealing the grave meant risking everything. So the secret held for another 12 years, until the empire that murdered the Romanovs finally collapsed itself. In 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the grave was officially exhumed. Scientists recovered 9 sets of remains. DNA analysis, using blood samples from living Romanov relatives and from Prince Philip, a distant relation of Alexandra, confirmed the identities. Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, and 3 members of the household staff. But 2 were missing. Alexei and one of the younger sisters, either Maria or Anastasia, depending on which forensic team you asked. For 16 more years, those 2 remained lost. Then, in 2007, a second shallow grave was discovered less than 100 feet from the first. 2 partial skeletons, a boy and a young woman. DNA confirmed them as Alexei and the missing sister. The family was complete. In 1998, 80 years after the execution, the Romanov remains were given a state funeral in St. Petersburg. The coffins were carried through the streets of the city Nicholas once ruled. Thousands attended. Russian President Boris Yeltsin stood at the ceremony and called the murders one of the most shameful chapters in our history. 2 years later, in 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the entire family: Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, Alexei, 7 saints. The 4 sisters who had once signed their letters with a shared nickname, who had mended their own clothes and taken cold baths and played in palace gardens, now had golden icons painted in their image. They would have found that extraordinary. They probably would have laughed. There is a photograph taken around 1913. The 4 sisters are sitting together on a balcony, leaning into each other, squinting against the sun. Olga looks thoughtful. Tatiana looks composed. Maria is smiling. Anastasia is mid-laugh. They look like any 4 sisters anywhere in the world. And that is the thing that stays with you. Not the crowns, not the palaces, not the execution. What stays is how ordinary they were inside the extraordinary. They bickered over hairbrushes. They wrote silly notes to each other. They had crushes they were embarrassed about. They got bored. They got scared. They made each other laugh when nothing was funny. The world remembers them as symbols, as the last gasp of an empire, as martyrs, as saints, as victims of history's great turning wheel. But they were not symbols when they were alive. They were Olga, who read poetry and hated formal dinners; Tatiana, who managed everyone and never complained; Maria, who wanted a soldier and a house full of children; Anastasia, who climbed trees and did impressions and could not sit still. They were daughters, They were sisters. They were young women who never got to find out who they would have become. The tragedy of the Romanov sisters is not just how they died. It is everything they were never allowed to live. It is still 1:30 in the morning. July 17th, 1918. 4 young women are standing in a basement room with no windows. Their father is beside them. Their mother is sitting in a chair. Their brother cannot walk. They are carrying small pillows. They are wearing dresses lined with diamonds. Olga is 22. Tatiana is 21. Maria is 19. Anastasia is 17. They think someone is coming to take them somewhere safe. Now you know who they were. Now you know how they lived. The cold baths, the shared bedrooms, the nicknames signed at the bottom of letters, the wounded soldiers they held, the guards they tried to befriend, the prayers their mother whispered. Now, when you see them standing in that basement, you see 4 sisters. And you understand what the world lost. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There are more lives like these. Extraordinary people who carried impossible weight and deserve to be remembered, not as headlines, but as human beings.